All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Elsa Afework, and I'll be today's host for BlackMentalHealthMatters.org. And today we have a very special topic with two very special guests, and the topic of PTSD and CPTSD, defining it and its impact on military personnel. I have two very wonderful guests, Mr. Green and Dr. Clark. I'll introduce Mr. Green. You served at the U.S. Navy as a lieutenant commander from 1975 to 1997. You spent 9 years as an enlisted man. You are an author of Black Officer, White Navy, as well as several accomplishments. So welcome to the show, Dr. Green. And Dr. Clark, you are a retired Department of Defense psychologist. You're a licensed professional counselor. You are a life transformation coach and life planning expert with a doctorate of education in counseling psychology. So welcome to to both of you on this very special topic. So we're very happy to have you today. Dr. Green, I'll start off with you. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you're located, and why you do what you do.
Well, first of all, I'm not a doctor. I'm a retired lieutenant commander. I do have a master's degree in human resources development. I live in Jacksonville, Florida, and I've been in Jacksonville, Florida since 1980 after I retired from the Navy. I have not had a job since I retired from the Navy because of some of the trauma I experienced towards the tail end of my career. And I've just been writing and speaking after 20 years of silence to try to bring attention to some of the issues you're about to talk about.
That's very good to hear, Mr. Green. Thank you so much. And Dr. Clark, tell us a little about yourself, what you do, and why you do what you do, and where you're located.
Clark, I go by my middle name, which is Suzanne. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. I do have right now maintain a very small private practice where I specialize in working with veterans and treating veterans who struggle with PTSD symptoms, and as well as adult survivors of child abuse and those who've been traumatized by other issues in their life. I am retired with the Department of Defense as a psychologist. And I guess I didn't want to stay in retirement, so here I am.
All right, that's good to hear. Welcome to both of you today, Mr. Green and Dr. Clark. I think on the topic of PTSD and CPTSD, defining it and its impact on military personnel, this is such an interesting topic within the realm of not only Black mental health, I think just mental health in general, and also in the military personnel, which is very crucial, and which is why we should be able to define PTSD, CPTSD alone and within the context of the military, and also talk about how PTSD and CPTSD affects people of color, particularly Black people within the military personnel. So with that said, my first question is to the both of you. I guess Mr. Green, you can go first because you're first on my screen. What is PTSD and what is considered CPTSD?
Well, the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder typically involves people that have experienced a incident involving violence. It's a life-changing event that causes them severe emotional, psychological distress. You can read the definition that the VA uses, and also that the DSM-5 reads. Complex PTSD, as I understand it, is people that have suffered from a prolonged series of events that have the same impact, which may not involve physical violence or death, but is just as psychologically damaging to that individual. That's my understanding, but I'm not a psychologist.
All right. Dr. Clark, anything to add to that?
Well, everything that Mr. Green has said is very accurate. I just would add that with PTSD, there's a lot of suffering from flashbacks, and severe anxiety, and a lot of ruminating thoughts about the event because of the psychological impact that tends to get the person kind of stuck in the trauma of it, because it happens so unexpectedly that it doesn't give the psyche a chance to make the adjustment. So it kind of gets PTSD, that it, as Mr. Green also so eloquently explained, it is a more complex version of that. But what tends to happen is you get an emotional layer over the psychological trauma that tends to make the symptoms that much worse.
Right. I think that's a wholesome definition for PTSD and CPTSD. So thank you for that to both of you. Is there a specific way that the military defines PTSD?
I believe that the military only looks at combat-related incidents where people are killed, let's say in accidents or crashes or something like that, and they do not really give much credence to the incidents of, say, a prolonged series of psychological abuse or racism that people may experience, or sexual harassment for that matter. Mm-hmm. I talked to a man who spent decades talking to Vietnam War veterans about PTSD. His name is Dr. Jonathan Shea, and he wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam. When I read that book, I cried both times all the way through the book, because I finally had found my tribe, people that I could, and I didn't serve in Vietnam. My father did 4 tours, and he did a tour in Korea as a paratrooper in a tank battalion. So his service was much more psychologically harmful, I believe, than mine was. And if that's the case, I understand why he didn't live to be age 50, died of a heart attack at age 46. So the other book I read was a book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger, the one who wrote the book about the perfect storm, and also a book about the Boston Strangler. And he has PTSD. He is a journalist, and he has PTSD. So he did a deep dive into what PTSD is, how it affects you. But neither one of those two people talked about what it was like to be a minority veteran going through these things and having the issue of race and racism layered over the top of that. And the VA and the Navy, the military, they don't want to talk about the racial issues. There is no Uniform Code of Military Justice article for racism, racist actions. And that's the armed services were desegregated in 1948. And to this day, there is no article that addresses racist actions that can cause people harm.
It's interesting you say that, Mr. Green, because even when I was looking at this topic earlier, I couldn't find anything that was related to race. And I was looking at, Black military personnel and PTSD and CPTSD, and I couldn't find anything. And I thought maybe it's because, it could be in an article that can only be found in, in the military archives or something. So it really is sad to see that there's a lack of other traumatic triggers to PTSD and CPTSD that people of color face. So, that's a really good way to define it. Dr. Clark, anything to add to what Mr. Green said?
No, and I haven't served in the military myself, and haven't been into campaigns in Desert Storm and Desert Shield. And haven't been a victim myself of both racism and sexual assault in the military. Yeah, there are no. There's nothing in the Uniform Code of Military Justice that addresses the racism that impacts a lot of the lives of Black and brown people who serve in the military. There's nothing specific that addresses that.
Yeah, that really is unfortunate, and I'm glad that we're highlighting that context within the realm of Black mental health here today. So I guess my follow-up question is PTSD or CPTSD, is one worse than the other?
I wouldn't say that one is worse than the other, but one layers over the other, because PTSD can be a traumatic response to a single event. However, if a person is already struggling with past traumas, or another trauma shows up before they have a chance to heal from the current one, then it begins to layer over it, and that creates the complexities that make up the emotional space of CPTSD, because it makes it more complex, because there's so many other things that you have to deal with one layer at a time before healing can occur. And one of those in the military is racism, and sociologically speaking, it might be poverty, it might be crime, it might be witnessing a crime, being part in an accident that layers over something that you're already struggling with as a military person. And those are rarely dealt with on your own individual level,
right,
because so much of it is embedded in the emotional response of the complexities of it. So.
I'd like to add something to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that just the very word complex indicates that there are more layers to the complex PTSD than the straight up PTSD. oftentimes people that have undergone a series of prolonged events of emotional abuse, they do that in addition to all the other things that people that suffer from PTSD have to deal with. So there's a layering over a prolonged period of time that builds up changes in your personality. And that's one of the things Dr. Shea said to me, that this changes your personality. It changes who you are, and it has an impact on every aspect of your life. And he said narrative storytelling is one of the best ways you can start on the path to healing, which is was very helpful to me to hear that after I'd written my book, where I laid out all the good, bad, and ugly, including my own, about what I had gone through. There's a doctor named Evan Simone. He's an attorney. He's a military trial lawyer, I believe. And he just did a groundbreaking study about the battles that veterans have in trying to get their racist discharge. I mean, their discharge is due to racism upgraded. And he talks about how the struggles they have to face because people tend to deny all of their experiences because they're not written down. Nobody gets an indication in their service record, PTSD, because they've been working in a racist command and facing all this prolonged racism. Who's going to put that in your record? So they have a battle, an uphill battle, trying to prove what it is they went through. And the people that perpetrated it certainly aren't going to come forward and say, yes, we did this to him or her. And so it's an uphill battle. And he did this study. It's available. There's something on YouTube about it. And you can also reach out to him on his LinkedIn channel. But I'm surprised that that has not garnered more attention than what it has in the veterans community and in the healthcare community, because it's really a groundbreaking study.
Yeah, I think that would be a really nice study to highlight for sure. And I think you both alluded to something that is, especially with complex PTSD, that you're going to have different layers of trauma, and every trauma is going to have a different response. It also needs a different treatment plan. And if it's not treated, it's just going to pile up on one after the other. And that's going to create that complexity of it all. And I think if it hasn't been addressed properly to begin with, like one trauma and it builds on the other, then how is one gonna, it's almost like it's a breakdown. I mean, that's what it is. It's a breakdown of all these other traumatic responses, and the person may not even be aware of how they'll be reacting when they're not just getting treatment, but when they're speaking with their community or when they're speaking with their tribe, like you said, Mr. Green. So, which, kind of leads me to my follow-up question, because I just came to know about CPTSD very recently, especially within the realm of, military and combat. So, and I read somewhere that they are often, I don't want to say confused, but they're often, they could be misconceptualized one for the other because they're considered sibling disorders. So why is it that they're called sibling disorders? If you can highlight that for us.
I'll pass that to the doctor.
Okay. Well, they're related. They're considered sibling disorders because of the similarities. Both will start out as PTSD. Mm-hmm. The complexities come into play when there are other layers that layer over the original PTSD itself. And so they're siblings because they're related. They both have the same acronym. It's just that now when you have other complexities, you have other things that you need to deal with. And so to kind of highlight the case, I dealt with a veteran several years ago who was in Afghanistan, and part of his job was to defend the border, to keep the enemy out, but they were always under constant fire. And so because of that, part of his job was picking up the bodies of the victims. And, that traumatized him tremendously. Well, at the same time, he was one of two Black males in the entire part of that infantry, and was undergoing a tremendous amount of racist behavior and activities as a result. So as a result of that, he struggled with horrific insomnia. And he'd be up for days at a time. Here we have another layer of trauma over what he's already having to do and what he has to deal with. And then when he gets out, comes back into civilian life, back into his own home country, now we have to deal with the police. And he's a Black male. So here's another layer of trauma that layers over the PTSD that he originally struggled with and suffered from. And those complexities they rarely get discussed, if at all. And so that in and of itself, that's what it means by siblings. That the PTSD is already there, but then you have these other layers that show up, and the complexities of them. Before you have a chance to deal with one, there's 2 or 3 more showing up.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to piggyback on that if I could.
Yeah, absolutely.
What she described mirrors my experience to a great extent. I did not serve in combat, but I served on ships in combat areas. I was a tactical action officer on a frigate in the Persian Gulf with weapons release authority. I'm the only black officer on the ship. And I had a racist incident. I added it up about once every 3 weeks. And I was the chief engineer on the ship, so I had the most difficult job on that ship. And I was the only black officer. I was the only one working outside, standing watch outside of my own department. So I had a tremendous amount of responsibility, but I was getting so much pushback from people because they didn't like working for a black officer. They didn't like having a black officer in charge of them or giving them orders, et cetera, et cetera. And I had one chief petty officer walk out of the space while I was on watch as a tactical action officer, ignoring an order I gave him. And I put him on report for a clear violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And my command did not back me up. It was very traumatic, and it was infuriating because I'm required to follow all of these rules, but they don't back me up when someone else does it. So you layer that on top of all the other tension and responsibility I was dealing with. I served back-to-back tours, 3 ships in a row, and I was the only black officer on each ship except for my first ship, where I had a subordinate for just a few months. So that is a series of incidents that just build and build and build upon each other. And it really does take a toll on you psychologically. And when I finally ran into the last 2 guys I dealt with that led for me to put in my papers and retire, I mean, that behavior was so blatant that I still to this day don't believe it. I detailed it all in my book in the last 2 chapters, and not one person has come forward to challenge my recollection of events. And some of those people are still alive and well and enjoying their retirement.
I mean, what Dr. Clark, clinically just described is literally what you experienced. And it really is unfortunate, which, I would think that being the military, they would have some sort of code of conduct on discrimination policies. And is it that it exists, but it's just not applied properly? Or is it just that it exists, but it's a hush-hush that, oh, you experienced it, then, just move on? Like, what was that like for you, Mr. Green?
Every branch of the service has these directives and instructions that say that discrimination is illegal and will not be tolerated and so forth and so on. But if you try to follow the procedures that are put in place for you to report discriminatory or racist behavior, that puts a big target on your back. You become a problem because now you're not a team player. You're going outside the chain of command. You're misinterpreting things, et cetera, et cetera. So every sailor and every serviceman knows that if I use that process, which is designed to fail me, it's probably going to end my career. I've had people say to me, did you know that filing a complaint was going to end your career? And my question to them is, if I'm following the proper procedures and reporting behavior that is illegal and wrong, why should I be worried about ending my career if I'm doing everything right? So the system is designed to fail you. And the reason it's designed to fail you is because no one really wants to acknowledge that it exists. I wrote in my book about Ron Dellums was a congressman from California. He traveled all over the world in the 90s. People were complaining about discrimination and racist behavior to him. So he required the Department of Defense to start providing annual reports on discrimination in the military. And they had to report the number of complaints, the number that was substantiated, and the number that was not substantiated. I'll give you an idea of how bad it was just in one service, the one I know best. In 1987, the Navy had about 50 complaints, and they substantiated 6% of them. In 1988, they had about 100 complaints, and they substantiated 3% of them. And then in 1989, 1 year after the CNO said that there was widespread bias and discrimination against blacks in the military, in the Navy, they had 156 complaints, and they substantiated 0 of them. So as the number of complaints goes up, and the service is acknowledging that we've got a problem, the substantiation rate drops from 6% to 0. It is currently, right now, about 6% in the Navy. It was about 20% until Donald Trump became the president, and then it dropped to 6%. So the Navy's gone backwards, and I suspect so have the rest of the military. It was so damaging to the Department of Defense. When I wrote this stuff in my book, and I put some of these things in my book, I said, you can go look for yourself at the addendums to the annual defense report. A few months after my book came out, all of that information was stripped from the internet. You can't find it anywhere. I have a complete file of every report that I've been able to get through the open sources and all through the Freedom of Information Act. But I submitted a FOIA request a couple of years ago for those updated statistics, 10 years worth of statistics. The Navy and the Coast Guard ignored me. The Marines gave me 10 years worth of spotty information, and the Air Force gave me 350 pages of data that detailed everything I'd asked for from E2 to 08. And in every pay grade, there were people that had successfully filed complaints of discrimination. The Navy completely and the Coast Guard completely ignored my request. So that gives you an idea of the extent of the problem.
I mean, it really is. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a problem that's not going to go away because you're the one that's experiencing it. You're the one that's following the actual proper procedure because the code of conduct exists. But it's almost like, like you said, the system is designed to fail. The policy is designed to fail, especially people of color and Black people. So, I'm glad you really brought that up because it really is such a, I mean, PTSD, CPTSD, like I said, it's a really extensive and crucial topic to discuss, especially for military personnel. So thank you for sharing that experience with that, Mr. Green, and Dr. Clark for providing the clinical perspective of the concepts themselves. I guess my next question is, and you both have alluded to before, but what are some of the most common factors or the most common criteria for a probable diagnosis of PTSD and CPTSD?
Okay, well, I will give that in a second. I just want to kind of add a little something to something Mr. Green was saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're talking about a diagnosis that is qualifiable for disability benefits. Okay. And should it be validated that so many of those of us African Americans have had to endure? And so actual diagnosable symptoms of PTSD, that falls in line with being qualifiably disabled. And so filing that with the Department of Defense or with the federal government for that disability compensation also ties into this. And there are many of us who've dealt with that. So, of course, I'm not surprised that some of the evidence that substantiates that is not forthcoming, because then that would validate the necessity of compensating those of us who had to deal with it, who are qualifiably diagnosed with PTSD, and they don't want that. And so to answer your question, some of these symptoms, for instance, intrusive memories, and they're not just memories that come and go. They are ruminating, and the memories are very graphic. It's like the brain keeps a recording of the event frame by frame in real life, and it continues to play over and over again in the mind. There are horrible dreams and nightmares. For instance, my former patient that I was telling you about, one of his ruminating thoughts and dreams that kept him literally wake up in a cold sweat is of watching the people, the victims that the bodies he had to deal with. Some of them died with their eyes open. He could not get that out of his head. And it was going over and over and over again to a point where he couldn't sleep for several days on end. And sometimes it took medication for him to be able to go to sleep. Emotional distress. The emotions are everywhere. It's anxiety, panic, breaking out in a cold sweat, literally for no reason, just sitting there driving in traffic. And the cars around him making him feel claustrophobic in his own car. Trying to avoid talking about the events, this kind of has a double-edged sword. If you don't talk about it and don't process it, it stays stuck in your soul, and all of those other symptoms stay stuck as well. But then when you do talk about it, it brings it back to the surface of the consciousness, and now you have to struggle with it all over again. Being in certain places, one veteran couldn't be in buildings anymore because he was having such a traumatic situation on the flight home from one of his duty stations that they tied him up and laid him on the floor of the plane. Well, then he became extremely claustrophobic. By the time he got back to his workstation, he could not function. And so another veteran, I'm sure you probably heard of, some veterans are so traumatized that if they hear the backfiring of a car, they assume it's gunfire and they will duck for cover. Well, that's very true, and it's very real.
Mm-hmm.
That does happen. Some go into what we call a catatonic state, where they get so frozen by the trauma that they've endured, they simply become frozen in place. They cannot move.
Mm-hmm.
And so the trauma is devastating
Mm-hmm.
in and of itself. And that's just with combat. I haven't even begun to talk about the other layers that come with that. So you take all of that for a young
Yeah.
Black male, and now he comes back to his country and he gets into a situation with the police. What do you think is going to happen? So there's another layer of trauma
Yeah.
happening all over again. So those are some of the, and then a couple of other things that happens when it's like Mr. Green was saying, how it changes your personality and changes everything about you. Your negative self-talk kicks in. All of a sudden, how you think of what you think of yourself and how you move in society changes. You lose interest in the things you used to enjoy. It isolates yourself from family members when you really want to be interactive, but you don't know how anymore because everything inside of you hurts.
Mm-hmm.
Always being on guard, afraid that somebody or something is going to jump out of the darkness and come for you. And another veteran woke up, and when he came to, he was strapped across his wife with his hands around her throat, having a traumatic experience, a flashback he didn't even realize was happening. So the trauma of it is absolutely devastating.
Mm-hmm.
And those are just some of the symptoms and that a lot of our veterans have had to deal with.
Right, and the fact that it is a lot more worse for Black males, like Mr. Green said earlier, like you said to Dr. Clark, as soon as you're discharged, you come home and you have to face the day-to-day struggles of being a Black man and a Black women as well, because there's also Black women in the military, and to have to go through that ongoing trauma. And it's like almost being in a not only catatonic state, but also like the flight or fright risk 24/7, where you don't know what the next thing is going to hit at you or who's going to come curse at you, say some racial things to you in your day-to-day life. So it's just unfortunate that there's a lot more factors and there's a lot more criteria, and I feel like it's a lot more worse for people of color.
Let me just add this real quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a prior military person, and I've been in combat, and I've met and worked with and treated a lot of veterans who have been. When we come back into civilian life, there is no debriefing. Okay. There's no way to nothing that helps you disconnect from the combat mindset back into society as a normal functioning civilian, if you will, if there is such a thing. And so there's no crossover effect. How we leave is how we come back into society. So the trauma that was there is going to come with us. Mm-hmm. It would be beneficial if there was a step deep in order to for the care that they're going to need, first of all, being able to move into society in such a way that is comfortable and healing. That doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go to the veterans,
I think. Go ahead.
And when you go to the Veterans Administration, I waited 20 years before I filed a claim because I was embarrassed, I was confused, I was angry. And it was only after one of my shipmates read my book and called me and said, Keith, you need to go file a claim. You qualify for veterans benefits because of what you went through. And I was fortunate enough that I had gone to see a mental health professional towards the end of my career when I was just being attacked on all sides. And she gave me a diagnosis of dysthymia, which was chronic depression. And if you read about what I went through, it's a miracle I wasn't catatonic myself. But I wanted nothing to do with the military for 20 years. And that's not unusual for veterans that have experienced these types of trauma to avoid anything to do with the military for decades. And then when they go to file their claim, they don't have any documentation to support it. And they wind up fighting for years and sometimes even decades, dying before they even get their claims approved. And that's one of the things Dr. Simone writes about in his groundbreaking paper. But fortunately for me, I had a buddy letter from an '06 JAG officer that I served with at the beginning of my career and the end of my career. And he said in his letter, I lost track of the violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that were conducted against Mr. Green. It was just one thing after another from E2 to '04. It was just a constant battle of fighting to do my job, getting access to resources, getting treated with respect, and trying to get people to back off of trying to to harm me, which was harming the unit, which was harming national security. Racism and PTSD are national security issues. You're losing good people who are deciding to vote with their feet, and that's harming our military, and then it harms our society, because rather than come back and be productive members of society, they're walking around trying to survive. I would break out into a sweat. My hands would break out into a sweat when I started filling out a job application or filling out paperwork to do with employment. I could not envision myself putting myself in an environment where someone would have that kind of power over me, because I was afraid I would harm them. So I just didn't have a job from the age of 39 to 65.
Dr. Clark, anything to add?
Well said. The experiences, he's what you're referring to, Mr. Green, I have heard, I've seen, I've treated, and have helped veterans with their own towards healing from a lot of what you're seeing. Breaking out in sweats, the trouble sleeping, the trouble concentrating, not wanting to fear that something triggered, so that then you don't turn around and harm somebody else. The guilt or shame of feeling like something you did wrong, but knowing you didn't do anything wrong, but how do you prove it? How is it that you say the reason I'm in this space is because of my color? And one of the reasons that the military has a hard time with the diagnosis of PTSD, particularly with African Americans, is because the underlying effect of it is our racism. Without that platform, then all we have left is UC and debate, and then we can follow through with the proper ways of dealing with things. But if the overarching issue is race itself, and you're having to deal with those who are in charge of the insecurity, they're not going to come forth and say I'm insecure, which is why I don't like this person.
Yeah. Dr. Clark, are you there? You just cut off a little bit, so.
Yes, it looks like it's getting ready to rain here, so I think we're having some weather issues. But yeah, I just want to compliment what Mr. Green was saying, and my heart goes out to you and the things you must have experienced. My son was a Navy officer and left to do his job and experienced some very similar situations. So I understand, and I can really appreciate your story.
Yeah, likewise, Mr. Green. I do have family in the military, not here, but back home where I come from. And the fact that you're really bringing this up, it's kind of hitting home for me, just because I can only imagine, at least here, I know that there are services that are, that do exist. I mean, it's not enough for marginalized communities, especially for Black people, but the fact that you are able to sit here and talk about it with us, it just means so much. So, and really, really, it's highly appreciated, both of you as well, like Dr. Clark as well, bringing in that clinical perception based on your case studies. So thank you for that. And I guess the next question would be, are there what are the treatment plans, and are these treatment plans similar or different in household for PTSD and CPTSD?
The treatment plan, okay, I'm going to see how I can frame this, because I'm not a big advocate for medication. I would rather more natural substances if possible, if at all possible. That does make the journey towards healing a little bit more complex, because it means you have to walk through the trauma, you have to unpack it, you have to process it and then find a way to put closure to it. So the cognitive behavioral aspect of it, that has worked very effectively with me. If medication is needed, it's more along the lines of physiological impressions, such as the panic attacks with the cold sweats, something that is a physiological issue, and the medication deals with the physiological aspect of it. Cognitively speaking, the best way that I have found it deals with it is through cognitive behavioral approaches. Let's talk it through, process it, put closure to it so that you can find peace in spite of what happened.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Mr. Green, have there been any treatment plans that have worked well for you in the past?
It took me 3 tries at counseling before I got to someone that could relate to my experiences. The first 2 people the VA sent me to, one was a white guy, and he told me on the first day that if I wasn't comfortable talking to him, he would completely understand that. He was very withdrawn in his posture, and he eventually told me that his wife was catching a lot of flack because she was from Alabama and all of the stuff that Judge Roy Moore was doing. And I'm like, how can you even make that comparison? You know, a white woman in Alabama who's feels under attack because people don't like Judge Roy Moore. And then the second one was almost, you know, as not helpful. He was explaining to me he could understand what I went through because he had to deliver a letter to a black church on a Sunday to the pastor, and he was scared to death. So, I mean, I don't know where they get making those comparisons, but for me, I didn't get any real help until the VA sent me to a black social worker who's working on a degree. His daughter was in the Navy, and he could completely and immediately identify with my experiences because we had shared experiences. I didn't have to explain to him what racism was or what it felt like. And his daughter was facing sexual harassment and racism in the military while I was talking to him. And one of the things that he did was help me understand that this is nothing to be ashamed of. And one of the things that I regretted most was that I did not continue to fight after I filed a 5-page discrimination complaint against my CO. Well, unfortunately for me, 5 days after that, the chief of naval operations committed suicide because he was getting a lot of flack because of the things he was trying to do to help women and minorities. So that took all the fight out of me. I said, if the chief of naval operations can't handle the pressure, why am I still here? So it's one of those things that my biggest regret was I didn't continue to fight. But every person that I've talked to in a mental health or professional capacity told me that I did the right thing. You know, pulled my complaint, which they withheld illegally. They had 48 hours to respond to it, to send it to the General Court Martial Authority. 10 days later, they had done nothing. So they were stalling, planning to betray me. And I knew that. I'd been in the system. I'd been an equal opportunity program specialist, and I had investigated helicopter crashes and complaints of mistreatment. So my biggest regret was being embarrassed that I didn't continue to fight for myself. The military teaches you to fight, to use weapons, to study the enemy, to do all these things to survive and to defeat the enemy. When you use those very same tools to fight for yourself, all of a sudden you become a problem. So there's a disconnect between understanding, you know, your role in the organization and your role in protecting yourself. When you use those very same exact skills to protect and defend yourself, then you become a problem. And that has a tendency to cause you to lose complete trust, not only in that organization, but in yourself and in the people they send you to for treatment. Only 2% of psychologists in the country are Black. So imagine trying to find a Black psychologist that will you be able to sit down and explain what you've went through when they don't have any frame of reference for it.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Clark, would you like to add to that?
He's absolutely right, and I will give you kind of a sort of it's a tongue-in-cheek story, and it would be tragic if it wasn't so funny at the same time. When I began to work with, are you back?
Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay, I don't know what that was, but okay. Just kind of give you. I was when I worked for the Department of Defense as a psychologist. Part of my job was talking with personnel on the base, military and civilian. And I had an appointment set up from one of the workers who wanted to come and talk with me about some issues. And so when he was escorted back toward my office, I just happened to be walking down the hallway, and the person that was bringing him to my office stopped and said, okay, this is your office. And he's about 6 feet tall. I'm only 5 foot nothing. And he's looking over my head. And he says, I don't see psychologists. And so I didn't say anything. And the gentleman that brought him there, he says, she's right here. So he looks at me rather strangely. He was a white male. And his exact words to me were, I ain't never seen no black psychologist before. And I said, you know what? Me either.
Yeah.
And he gave me a strange look. And I said, okay, are we done? Can we talk now? And that was the end of that. Of course, I never saw him again because I think I pissed him off. But just to kind of give you an idea of how ludicrous that mindset is, he actually said that to me, that he'd never seen a black psychologist before. Like, okay, me either. So let's talk.
Right.
And so, but Mr. Green is right. They're only if there's 2%, yeah, at best. And there's a reason for that. That one goes all the way back into when I was doing my research when I was in grad school and looking into why. They're gatekeepers there to make sure we don't get into the profession, to make sure we stay out of that profession. Because we can help our own communities heal from a lot of the tragedies that have been imposed on us because of racial bias. Well, if you don't want a community to heal, you're not going to train any healers.
And if you don't want to expose the extent of the damage, then you keep the people out that are willing to do that and that are in a position to do that, because they will believe what their patients are telling them, document it, and then forward it so that people can't ignore it anymore.
Exactly. So it's up and down the chain. It's not, this is not in a vacuum. It's very, very coordinated. Very coordinated.
I'd like to talk for a second about the blowback that I received from the medical community when I was under the TRICARE program. Can I do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I was having issues with my PSA, my prostate. So I went in, my prostate jumped dramatically. I went in to see a urologist, and I made the mistake of telling him, he's a young white guy, urologist in his 40s. And I made the mistake of telling him that I had written a book about my experiences in the Navy, and he wanted to know the title of the book. So I handed him a flyer, Black Officer, White Navy, and his face transformed immediately. It was like I handed him a dog turd or something. And the very next time I saw him, a little over 6 months later, they did a biopsy, and the biopsy was negative. He told me we may have to do another one because just because we didn't find anything doesn't mean anything is there. So about 6 months later, I had not received a call. So I called his office and said, hey, I'm calling to find out what's the follow-up on my results. The doctor had indicated that he might want to do another biopsy if my PSA was still elevated, and it had increased. So she put me on hold. The receptionist put me on hold. She comes back about 4 or 5 minutes later and said, the doctor wants you to have another biopsy. So we scheduled a biopsy. I went in to have it done. They didn't have my medicine there, so they gave me a pill. And as I'm laying on the table with my pants down, waiting for the biopsy to be conducted, the doctor walks in and questions me, why are you here? And I said, well, because your office scheduled me for this biopsy. No, we didn't. You did this all on your own. You circumvented the system. I said, no, I did not. I said, I spoke to the person, laid it all out. And he says, yes, you did. I said, no, I didn't. I was about to get up off the table because this guy's angry at me and I haven't done anything. He says, do you want me to conduct this procedure? And I almost got up off the table, but I wanted to know whether I had prostate cancer or not. Well, I said, yes, but when this is over, I want you to get to the bottom of this. This was 9 days after the insurrection. I had just watched on TV those people chasing Officer Goodman around in the Capitol building. And one of them, the guy that was in the lead position, looked just like this doctor. So you can imagine how traumatic it was for me to lay on that table and have a doctor angry with me and accusing me of something I haven't done. And the only thing I could figure was he was still angry because I'd written about my experiences. Well, I filed a complaint the next day, the next working day. And a few days later, I filed a written complaint, very lengthy, detailed everything, witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. He called me a liar out in the waiting room where patients could hear it, and he called me a liar in the room. A few days later, he calls me up, tells me, Mr. Green, you've got prostate cancer. This is not life-threatening immediately, blah, blah, blah. You need to come in and schedule a treatment, plan, et cetera. But since you're not happy with me, go find yourself another doctor. So now he's firing me because I've complained about his behavior after he did the procedure that was necessary to show what my condition was. So once again, I filed another complaint with the Inspector General's office. No one contacted me from the Inspector General's office. They investigated my complaint against him and his chain of command without ever talking to me. So then I filed a complaint with TRICARE. I filed a TRICARE grievance. I said, from the commanding officer that's protecting him to this doctor, I trust no one in this organization. You expect me to receive care from these people after they treated me this way? Their response was, this does not rise to a level of a grievance. The commanding officer has the option of releasing you to outside care. So I followed every step of the way, the process, and I got no satisfaction at any level. His commanding officer called me and told me that I had done nothing wrong, and that she had a discussion with this doctor about professionalism. I said, I want to know why this happened to me. And she said, we may never know why this happened to you. And I said, well, I've conducted investigations. You give me about 5 minutes and I can find out why this happened to me. But the bottom line was they were protecting him at my expense. And I told her, this set me back in my treatment. And my treatment has been extended because this trauma is layered on top of all the other traumas I've experienced. And you're telling me that you can't find out why I was treated this way. I put in my final complaint. I believe that he was upset because I was writing about my experiences with racism and discrimination in the military, and he was going to use his position and authority to punish me. Retaliation is very real, whether you're in the military or you're out of the military. I faced a lot of it because of my advocacy and writing on LinkedIn and articles and stuff. I get attacked and called a racist all the time. It doesn't stop just because you're no longer in the military. It can continue, and the medical profession was identified as something that needed special attention by the Task Force 1 Navy report that came out almost 2 years ago.
I mean, that really made me sad just to even think about it. The fact that you had to fight for your life, and a doctor is willing to break his own code of conduct to, instead of treating you, to fire you and to say, just because he's, blatantly, I'm going to say it, just because he's racist and he has his own biases against his own, racist behavior. And it really is unfortunate. And I'm really, really, thank you for sharing that, because it's just, you really are depicting the realities of, not just a military personnel, but a day-to-day struggle of what it is like to be Black, not just in America, not just in Canada, but in the world. Is you have to fight for yourself. You have to build these defenses on top of your traumatic experiences just so that you can get treated or you can get by in life. So really thank you for sharing that, Mr. Green. And we kind of discussed this before, but are there treatment plans? Are these treatment plans? I guess this may be more for Dr. Clark, and Mr. Green can talk about your experience as well. But are there case-to-case basis? Are they different from case-to-case basis? Like, for example, someone with a different ethnic background, or someone with a different gender, someone with a different race. Do the treatment plans differ based on the case or the case of the person?
Yeah, the treatment plans do. They're very case by case sensitive because a Black female situation who has been targeted for sexual harassment, for instance, or sexual assault case is going to be different from a young man who experienced sniper fire for a year and a half because of his position in the military, or if let's say with a white female who's experiencing sexual harassment on the job, as opposed to a person who is gay in the military. And the traumas are going to feel different, and they're going to be different. The ethnic backgrounds, and yes, if you're African American in the military, racism is most of the time is at the core of the initial traumatizing situation. because most of us, all we want to do is a good job. That's it.
Mhm.
We try to follow the rules. We try to follow the regulations, just to try to stay out of trouble, and achieve rank. Try to,
Mhm.
and just want to build a career and live good life. And I'm not saying that all of us are angels, because there's good, bad in every community.
Mhm.
However, for the most part, we don't come in there with chips on our shoulders trying to game the system, or trying to be something we're not. We just want to do a good job. That's it.
Mhm.
And so, but if you come up against a system that is used to operating as a unit, in and
Mhm.
of in protecting each other from some very dysfunctional things in society, and everybody's in the same mindset, then they're going to assume that it's okay to protect the ones who are violating, because it keeps them protected.
Mhm.
And then after a while, they all start to move the same way. And then what ends up happening is those of us of a different ethnic background or race, we're not part of that group. So we're the ones who become targeted because of somebody else's insecurities, that's being well protected by somebody that looks like them.
Mhm.
And uh, so now when they step into my office, yeah, their situation is going to look very different.
Mhm.
The case is going to be treated very differently, because it has to be sensitive to the individual layers that they have experienced based on their traumas.
Mhm. I mean, exactly what you said, Dr. Clark, about the system protecting the person is literally what Mr. Green gave us an example about his experience. So, and I guess follow-up question would be for Mr. Green. Does it make, you kind of mentioned it earlier, but does that make a difference to you when it's someone, at least a person of color versus a white psychiatrist, in when you get the treatment? Is there, what's the feeling like for you when you walk in and you're received well by someone that you can relate to, versus someone that is giving you their experience about being scared just because they walked into a church full of Black people? I mean, it's a laughable example that they gave you, but what is that like for you as a veteran?
I can't tell you the feeling of relief I got when I walked in there and saw that I was going to be talking to a Black male that I did not have to explain things to, that had his own experiences that he shared with me of dealing with racism. And he had family members in the military. He counseled members of his church. He's also a pastor. So he was well versed and well aware. Uh, Studies have shown that people do better when they have a doctor of the same ethnicity. This is particularly true for Black women in pregnancy. A Black
Mhm.
woman with a Black obstetrician or gynecologist has a much better chance of having a successful pregnancy than she does if she's got a physician of another race. So
Mhm.
that affinity and that shared understanding is extremely powerful and extremely helpful. I got nowhere essentially. Um, I could see the physical discomfort that I was causing these two white males when I was talking about the things that I experienced. Even the person that took my claim for PTSD, my claim for PTSD was denied. I was diagnosed with depression, but not
Mhm.
PTSD. I believe that the benefits would have been higher or different had I been diagnosed with PTSD, but it wasn't documented in my service record. And it's rarely documented in anyone's service record in the military. So
Mm-hmm.
the system is designed to give you the lower level of diagnosis so the VA can save money. But yeah, I
Mhm.
would say that having someone that has a direct uh, um, uh, community relationship with you, or ethnic background, or whatever the case may be, that is powerful, because trying to explain to someone who's got a wall of defenses built up what you're going through, it can be an exercise in frustration.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I guess in that case, then this will be for you as well, Mr. Green. In in your years of service in the military, have there been psychiatrists, or are there psychiatrists? They could be Black or white, but or any other race for that reason. Are they of a military background, or are they just trained psychologists in the military? And does that make a difference in receiving treatment?
That would be for Dr. Clark. That's not my lane.
All right, over to you, Dr. Clark.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part of your question.
Oh, no, I was just asking, are the people, are the psychiatrists usually people with a military background? And does that make a difference whether they are or not in when patients are receiving treatment?
And it does make a difference, because it's okay. We do maybe one, maybe two courses at best in intercultural or culturally diverse populations when it comes to counseling and intervention. And most of it is written in a book, not experienced in society. And so, and most of the time in those books, you're going to get some allusions to, they're going to allude to racism, but they won't talk about it. And they certainly don't talk about why it happens. And we can see now just in society right now with this fake campaign called CRT to try and ensure that the history is not taught. Well, there's a reason for that. And so when you take that and place that in the space of psychiatry or psychology, if they don't have the historical context in order to understand the trauma in the first place, then they're going to come into it with defenses on their shoulders. Because as soon as we start talking about it, and if I'm Black and the therapist happens to be white, probably the first line of defense is disbelief. And so if you're going to already disbelieve me right off the gate, then you can't talk to me or you can't treat me. Or if you do, it's going to be with defenses up. And so it does make a difference. I can tell you, having been on insurance panels before retiring, that the insurance companies would call and say the person that we're speaking with exclusively asked for a Black and African American therapist. And they would refuse to go see anyone else. And a lot of times when I do talk with them, I have to unpack trauma that they experienced talking to someone of another group that could not only not identify or relate to their experiences, but outright call them liars and call them racist for being upset about it. So it does matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly what Mr. Green talked about from his experience again. So thank you for explaining that clinically. And I guess the follow-up question, I guess, would be for you, Dr. Clark, but of course, Mr. Green can chime in as well. And you alluded to this, and which is the most crucial aspect, is that, the most common signal that you would see in patients with PTSD or CPTSD, especially Black people, being race as a factor. So what are other, I guess, most common signals or factors that you would see in patients with PTSD or CPTSD when you diagnose them?
Some of their background issues. Okay. In addition to combat, there's adult survivors of child abuse, victim domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual abuse, physical assault, being victims of a crime. Living under threats of assault or somebody bullying you. Just being in a plane crash. People who I've had clients who were in stores when the store was being robbed and they were shot at. So all of those indicate that we're going to be dealing with some underlying traumas. And again, that's a situational and circumstantial space. We haven't even touched on what they were already dealing with. And that's when it becomes the complex.
Right. All right. Thank you for that, Dr. Clark. I guess the next question would be for Mr. Green. Upon you leaving the military, were you discharged with, I guess, proper documentations of things such as, follow-up counseling or follow-up sessions with psychiatrists for treating with PTSD or CPTSD?
No, I had the usual exit interviews and classes and whatnot. There was very little discussion about anything psychological back then. There was certainly nothing mentioned about PTSD. But my goal was to get out of the military without having any further problems. I had filed the complaint against my CO. I agreed to pull my complaint if he would give me some basket leave so I could get out, early. And I just wanted nothing to do with the military. I avoided military bases. I had never seen a military doctor about mental health issues while I was on active duty. And I don't think there's enough attention to pay to those issues, particularly for Black servicemen. All of the services acknowledge that racism is a problem, but they're not addressing those particular issues. I wrote an article that said that until they start addressing the everyday racism that people are facing and holding those racists accountable, nothing's going to change. There are thousands of people reporting racist and extremist behavior, and they are getting no guidance from their organizations on how to deal with that. Well, you can imagine what happens when they're processing out of the military. You don't get it while you're there. I would caution every service member, if they're suffering from anxiety, depression, or any other mental health issues, have it documented in your service record before you leave the service record. Before you leave the military. Have some sort of documentation that you reported this behavior and you were counseled or treated for this behavior, because that will help you with your claim for the VA. If you wait 20 years and you don't have any documentation, I might have been still fighting to get the disability that I received. Fortunately for me, I held on to little pieces of paper that documented what had happened to me. And it also helps to tell your story. I wrote a whole book about it, 350 pages. And so telling your story can help other people that are facing the same thing. I've had so many people come up to me and thank me for what I've been doing and ask my help for various things, including filing complaints, including filing claims with the VA. I had a flag officer contact me and said, "Hey, I just got your book." He said, "But my 17-year-old son took it from me, and I'm going to read it when I get it back from him. He's thinking about joining the military, and he wants to know what it might be like." There are very few books that have been published by African Americans about their experience, either in the Vietnam era or in the post-Vietnam era. So if more people start sharing their experiences and telling their stories, the stigma will disappear, and the services might start paying more attention, and including the VA.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you wrote that book, Mr. Green. I think it's going to be very, very helpful. It will continue to be not just for up and coming, Black male or Black female military personnel, but those that really want to know what it was like, and, that shared traumatic experience itself. It is a way of treatment in of itself. It's not a clinical treatment, but it's more of like a communal, like you said, that tribe. I think that tribal healing that you mentioned at the beginning of our podcast. So I'm so glad you wrote that book, and I want to read it myself. So thank you for even putting it out there. I know it's not that easy, so it's very, very much appreciated. And I guess I just have two more questions. I guess my second last question would be, how can war veterans, military personnel, and or those affected with PTSD and CPTSD learn to better manage their symptoms? And Mr. Green, you can go first.
I can only speak from my own experience, but as I said, Dr. Jonathan Shea, he spent an hour on the phone with me, and he spent decades counseling veterans. And he said, narrative storytelling is the first step towards healing. You have to tell your story. Your family doesn't know what you went through. Your friends don't know what you went through. And you may not even fully process it until you write it down and lay it all out there for you to look at. You see what happened to you in sequence and in chronological order, and that can help you understand your own behavior. I thought getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and walking around the perimeter of my house at night with a pistol in each hand was normal. I did that for months after I retired because of the trauma that I'd experienced. I didn't think there was anything wrong with that. I was dreaming about monsters and, a conflict and stuff. I was worried someone was coming after me because of what I'd been through. So talking about those behaviors is one of the things that I think is the best thing that a veteran can do, and not being afraid or embarrassed or ashamed because of the stigma of mental health issues that you've experienced. After I finished my book, I sat with a pistol in my hand for 30 minutes thinking this will be so much easier if I could make all this go away. And I finally got mad, and I said, thinking about what my father went through, what would my father think if I stopped fighting at this stage in my life now? And I'm so glad that I put that pistol down and didn't become one of those statistics. But it is a real danger of not getting this stuff out, that people die with their stories untold, with no treatment and no help. And that's why I'm speaking out, because I don't want other people to go through what I went through.
Mhm. Dr. Clark?
Oh, well, thank you for that, Mr. Green. I have a tremendous amount of respect for you. That's an amazing journey that you've taken, and your healing is absolutely inspiring. Um, and you're right, because of the trauma, it's not unusual for us to get caught up in certain behaviors that to others would not look normal. But because it also ties into a sense of safety that is so much needed when you're dealing with these traumas, um, that veteran doesn't realize that it's not normal because it's connected to safety, it's connected to survival, and it's connected to a sense of security, and that's how they get through those very difficult moments. And then after a while, sometimes a veteran can hit a wall and say, you know what, I can't do this anymore. This is too much, and it could be either the sharing that Mr. Green said. I had a veteran who literally tried to drink himself to death and make it look like an accident because he just didn't want to deal with it anymore. And so, but he was right. Tell your story, unpack it, and that's what I meant earlier. And I said, yeah, you have to unpack the stuff. Let's talk it through. I consider myself a living journal. I will be your journal. Just get it out of your system. Leave it here in the office. Don't try to deal with it by yourself anymore because you're not alone anymore. Let's talk about it here. Let's put some context to it. Let's make something make sense. Make sense out of the insensible. And let's figure out how we can get you to a space of healing so that you can be at peace with yourself. Okay, so.
Yes, absolutely. And, Mr. Green, I just want to say I'm so glad you put that pistol down just because you're here today, willing to share your experiences with us. And it shows how resilient you are, not just as a Black person, but as a person who's went through so much in their life. So it's truly an honor to share, to be able to listen to your story and for you to be able to share that on this podcast. And I really hope this podcast becomes, also a source of healing for those that really, really wanted to know about this and that really wanted to know how to learn and how to cope. And also from Dr. Clark's, clinical expertise as well. I guess my last question would be for Dr. Clark, but what can psychologists and psychiatrists do to help patients cope better and integrate well into society post-discharge?
Well, the first thing is we need some type of debriefing system, a debriefing system in place that helps a veteran transition from military into civilian life because they are two very different worlds. But in doing so, they're going to be party to hearing the traumas of that military life as well. But that's part of the transition. That's part of the debriefing. Is that because of the issues that occurred while you were in active duty military or as a military officer, you got to be able to put that stuff somewhere before transitioning back into society, so that you can transition at peace and not caught up or tied up in the trauma of it. Because with all of the trauma comes all the other things like the guilt, the shame, the isolation from family, the confusions, the fears of getting it wrong in civilian life because you thought you got it wrong in military life. So basically, the first order, the one biggest ones that psychologists and psychiatrists can do, and they can be at the forefront, the gatekeepers of that, is the debriefing of our military personnel to make a smoother transition from military life into civilian life. They are two very different worlds.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that, Dr. Clark. Any last words, Mr. Green, Dr. Clark, before we wrap this up?
I just want to thank you for having this discussion about the issues that military veterans face regarding racism. It is underreported, underdiscussed, and underfunded. So I just want to thank you for what you've done. And Dr. Clark, you and I need to talk. I have a feeling that we could do some work together.
Okay, sir. I absolutely agree. I would love to meet up with you, catch up with you, so we can talk more and
All
maybe
right,
come up with some solutions.
have your people call my people.
Okay. All right. I would need to know how to reach you, but I'll ask Miss Afework. How do you pronounce your name?
Afework, yes.
Okay.
Afework.
I'll go through you to help me with that, because I don't know how to get in touch with Mr. Green, but it's okay.
Absolutely.
But I guess the final words that I would offer is one of the things that has helped a lot of the veterans that I've worked with is they don't understand the amount of personal inner strength that's already embedded and hidden behind the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I actually let them do is not just to find that strength, but give it a name. Because when you give something a name, you breathe life into it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, then the person can understand what their strengths are, and they can build on it in order to empower themselves past the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just want whoever's listening, and if the veterans are listening, whoever, if I just wanted to offer that you have strengths embedded inside of you that you may not be aware of, and find those, because that's what's going to pull you back into that space of healing that you want to be in.
That's a really that's an amazing takeaway message, Dr. Clark. And I'm looking at Mr. Green as you're saying it, because we're seeing a living proof of that here today. So thank you so much for both of you. It truly is an honor to have you, Mr. Green and Dr. Clark. Just I'm learning so much, and I'm still, it's a lot to process. Like I said, I do have some military people in my life, but I never got to hear or learn about their experiences this way. So thank you so much for coming and for coming here and sharing this on such a crucial topic. And I'm really glad this podcast exists, because at least talking about it is also a healing process in and of itself, and journaling it, like Mr. Green said, and putting that a word into it, like you said, Dr. Clark. I think those are really good takeaway messages. So without further ado, I guess my last tidbit question is, where can people find you if they have questions? And I'm sure they will, or if they wanted to know more about you. Do you have any social media pages or any other things you would like to share with us that we could put a link to on our podcast?
I primarily operate from LinkedIn. Reuben Green, former naval officer. I do have a Twitter page, and I don't even remember my Twitter handle, so don't bother with that, because I don't look at it anyway. But I'm on LinkedIn, and you can get my contact information from there. Connect with me, and I'm happy to talk to anybody. And the title of my book is Black Officer, White Navy. It's on Amazon. It is being republished. It was acquired by the University Press of Kentucky. They contacted me and said, we want to publish this book. So sometime next year, there'll be an adult version that is not so much alcohol infused. And it will primarily stick with just the Navy. I cover a lot of ground, but LinkedIn or Amazon for Black Officer, White Navy.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Mr. Green. Dr. Clark?
Okay, same. LinkedIn, and I don't remember what my name is. I think it's either Dr. Carmen Clark, and which I never use my first name. If not, it's under Dr. Suzanne Clark. And you'll see retired psychologist. That's kind of how I started. That's how you know it's me. And you can reach me by email. I think my phone number is also there. I'm trying to find my number of my office assistant, because she would be the best way to reach me would be through her, and I don't have that number. But I will find Mr. Reuben, Mr. Green. I will find you and connect.
And my email address is KEITHKEEFUS, Keith Keefus at AOL. My phone number is 904-568-8792. And I'll talk to anybody, just not collect.
And that's a good point. Let me give you my email address then. It's
Sounds good.
Okay, letter C is in cat, my last name Clark. So C Clark 4942 at AOL.com.
All right, that sounds great. Thank you so much for both of you again for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. And I would love to have you both again for future shows. Absolutely, we will have this topic again and integrated with other guests as well, so that we could really dive into other facts that we haven't covered. I feel like we haven't even covered it. We just touched surface today, but I hope to get deeper into this, to have meaningful conversation and wholesome conversation surrounding PTSD and CPTSD among Black people. So thank you so much and have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you, and you as well.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. All right.
No problem.
And
Goodbye.
next time I'll show my face. All right.